stop. Aha, it worked. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much, Tricia and Paul, for giving up an hour of your time today to spend and chat with us. Paul, as you know, is one of the co-authors of Change Myths. He's also the author of The Science of Successful Organizational Change, which I read back in 2015 and became a lifelong fan of Paul and have been following him since, and very glad to call him a friend. And Tricia, who I've met through Change Myths. Hi, Tricia. Tricia is an awesome change activist, I want to say, but you maybe want to call yourself something different, but also is a specialist in behavioral sciences and all things to do with evidence-based practices. So really super excited to have you on the call today. It's going to be a bit of a sort of a riffing session. So it's not going to be one of your formal podcasty type things. We're going to try and make it a bit more conversational. I will be managing the time and also managing the buttons, please note, Paul. And hopefully we'll have a bit of fun as well. It is recorded, so for those of you who can't join today, hope you enjoy the conversation. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to manage the time. I'm really not going to do that much. I might chip in a few questions here and there just to keep us on track. But essentially, it's Paul and Tricia's show. So I'm going to hand over to Paul and Tricia to do what you want to do. And I'll make sure I'm keeping an eye on the time and also keeping an eye on the chat box. So if you want to ask questions as we're going along and you're not getting a chance to get a word in edgeways, then please put them in the chat box and I'll keep a check on what's going on in there. So without further ado, over to you and Paul. Over to Tricia and Paul. Go for it.
Zoom is being a little buggerish with me. So I want to ask, do you people see on your screen a thing which says Zoom quit unexpected?
No, we don't. We see the slide.
We see a slide with DABDA that says it's changed like dying, and it's not in presentation mode.
And now
Zoom just quit as soon as I screen shared.
And now we can't see you, Paul. So you've disappeared from... I did say this was going to be one of those riffing sessions. And true to form.
I'm sorry. Zoom just crashed when I tried to screen share.
Do we want to go around and say where everybody's from, and then Paul and I can introduce ourselves, or?
We've got about 21 on the floor. So maybe what we'll do is we'll put, if you want to put in the chat box where you're from, that would be great, because I think to do that with 21 people might take up a bit too much time.
Fair enough.
Yeah, put in the chat box where you're from so that Tricia and Paul can see who's on the call today.
Zoom is being really unhappy.
We can see your screen, but we can't see you, Paul. So
well, that's probably an advantage if you look like me. Look, a long time ago, folks, Zoom is going to crash again, I think. This is really...
How weird. And we've lost Paul. So Tricia, do you maybe want to take over and just introduce us to what Paul might have been saying?
Sure. You know, I have a little bit, I probably won't do it justice, but I think the way he wanted to start out was just sort of a little bit about his journey of how we got to Change Myths, how he got there and where I came along and joined the journey. And as Ro mentioned, she was a fan of The Science of Organizational Change. I think it originally came out in 2015. And then it was a new edition was published in 2019. Gosh, I hope I have my ears right since Paula's not on. And that was really, it was a big quest for him. He had started his consulting career and he had been working in OCM. I tend to use organizational change management, OCM acronym. I prefer that term to change management. So if I say OCM, that's what I mean. And he actually took a sabbatical from PwC and dove in. And the result was this book, The Science of Organizational Change, which has been hugely successful. Years later, it still sells copies. It's actually also how Paul and I met and became acquainted and became friends and became what I call professional partners in crime. And then from that book, just life goes on and things change around the world. And he got interested in a topic called that's referred to as information disorder. That's essentially, I feel terrible. I'm not going to do it justice when he listens to this recording. He's going to be like, oh, Tricia, you left out this point. But it's essentially these effects that we're seeing with the growth of the amount of information that is available, whether it's internet or email or digital connectivity, and just how that, like, the amount of information that's available to us today is not even fathomable compared to even 10, 20 years ago. And how with that growth of information available, you've also had this issue with quality. Anyone can be a content creator, anyone can publish. So it's resulted in some of the false flags, the fake news, and some of those things that we've all heard about and hear about every day in the news. And sort of and Paul got really interested in that, and I think even went on the speaker circuit a bit on that topic. So it's an area he's very passionate about, which is why I'm going to be embarrassed when he listens to what I said.
He's back.
Okay.
You don't have to be embarrassed. He's back.
I know the gist. I knew what he was going to talk about. I'm just not doing it justice.
It's really one of these frustrating things. It crashes as soon as I do a screen share. So Trisha set it up pretty nicely. My real worry is about, we live in the information age, is how do we as human beings who are processing petabytes of information that come at us. There's a study from Los Angeles that said we read the equivalent of 174 newspapers a day. Seems like a lot to me, but from all of the incoming digital information in one form or another, perhaps it's reasonable. And so some of that is of mixed quality, and some of the stuff in Change is of mixed quality. And so that's called by information scientists information disorder. It includes things like fake news and all that kind of stuff. And the thing is, in this world, I think we need to be better critical thinkers. And so that's part of a big thing that inspires Trisha and I, is that, you know, we need to be able to think critically about everything, about parenting and about bleach cures for, you know, COVID, and about, in the United States, we have this thing called QAnon, which I won't trouble you with, but it's kind of a strange thing. And then also things like right-brained leadership, you know, in LinkedIn, you see all the time, you know, people talk about, oh, what it means to be a right-brained leader and so forth. And, you know, people who are trained psychologists just go, oh, golly, good golly, there's no such thing, stop it. But anyway, so I think it's incumbent upon us as a world to become better critical thinkers and as change practitioners. And the history of change management is, it, you know, it grew up in the 1980s, and Peters and Waterman and John Cotter and Prosci, I think, wrote his book in 1988. And it was mostly people making stuff up from the benefit of their wonderful experience as human beings and as change people around the world. And, you know, not to denigrate it, there was no such thing as change management when I started consulting in 1993. And boy, the consequences were horrible, the sorts of things, because we didn't really think about, there was an assumption then that I still gets made today, is that if you tell people, you know, is that, well, it's an overestimation of the authority people have who are in power to influence people who report to them and their organizations. It's an assumption that if you provide people with a business case, they'll go, oh, that's such a reason why, you know, all of these kind of stupid assumptions that people make. And I worked on so many failed change programs, it was ridiculous, failed strategy projects and failed technology implementations and all that. So that was the thing that got me. And then there's another question, is one of the things that we say in the book is that popularity is a proxy for expertise. So Myers-Briggs, can't remember, Trisha, correct me if I'm wrong, is that $100 billion, the psychometrics $100 billion industry? Is that right? Tell me if I'm full of baloney.
I think the number we determined when we were doing our research was 1 to 2 billion.
All right. That's a lot of money to be spent on something that questionable provenance, and even the ones Myers-Briggs, which has been studied to death. There are loads. I'm trained in something called the Herman Brain Dominance instrument that I trained in the 1990s. What else did I train in? All kinds of funky stuff. So we have to question the provenance of these things. And so that was my project. And the tool that we provide in the book, and I'm sorry I don't have slides, but it's a very easy acronym. It's called LIAR. And it's from one of your great Australian philosophers called Jennifer Duke Young, who's at Macquarie. She's a proper philosopher, and she dragged this out of epistemology. Epistemology says that there are basically 4 ways you know something. You know something because an authority figure has told it to you. So your doctor or a medical, you're some sort of figure who you trust. Your intuition, you might know something because it makes sense intuitively. And that can be really valuable. You know, some people think I'm an intuition troll that I just disregard or disdain anyone who uses their intuition to make decisions. It's not the case. I remember, you guys remember the 70% of change projects fail that came out in the early 1990s. Now,
I know, Paul, you like to say that it's gone, but I still see it all the time on my thread. So I think it's still very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, like that was said by John Cotter and Nitin Noria, both are Harvard Business School professors. And, so there, the knowledge that we claim to possess comes from authority. But if you were using your intuition, you'd say, holy shit, that seems like an awfully big number, does it not? I wonder, what evidence do those guys have? So anyway, intuition isn't always, it can be it can be a good test. Another test is logic, whether something adds up. And logic really helps us when we think about generalizations. So for example, one simple generalization, change be difficult, right? How apt is it how easy is it to generalize that from that to all change is difficult? For example, in Strategy and Business magazine, which is an otherwise very good magazine, David Rock, is he Australian as well? Wrote an article called Brains Hate Change.
He is Australian. Yeah.
Well,
he's certainly based in Australia, whether he's Australian.
What a magnificent businessman. But he did say something in Strategy and Business that brains hate change, and he tried to justify that idea neurobiologically by saying that change was logic. Logic in the area of death and what the heck is
Sorry, can I just ask everybody to mute their microphone? We're hearing background noise in there. Yeah, so if you can just
I muted everybody. So Paul and Roy, you should probably unmute.
All right, here we go. So when you think about death and dying, so logic gives us access to a certain way of thinking about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. A model developed in the 1960s by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was not just a researcher, she was a campaigner and an activist. And a lot of the transformation in the way we think about the experience of dying and how we treat the dying and how we care for the dying, the hospice movement, palliative care, all of these things partly arose from this woman's campaign, because in those days, doctors would lie to patients about their prospects, lie to their families, withhold information. The dying were called hopeless patients, and they were stuck off in a corner of the hospital. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a brilliant campaigner. However, does it mean that denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance is a template for organizational change? Is change like dying? And is it useful? And so we can use logic to say, is it an appropriate generalization? Can you take this data from one corner of the world and apply it over here? Can you take neuroscience and apply it in organizational change? Can you take denial, anger, bargaining and a practice? And logic gives us access to that sort of thing. Basically, do the premises follow from the conclusion, to use a nerdy philosophical word. And anyway, the final thing in liars are research evidence. And there's a chapter in Change Myths on different kinds of evidence, and we'll probably speak to that in a bit. So that's the sort of backdrop to the book. And much as I would like to be the guy who blesses change models and says this one is okay and this one isn't, and this one's full of baloney and this one's great, I can't be that. And even if I were qualified, I don't even know what qualified to do that would be, but I think the main...
You're not. Only science and research is qualified, and it's not one person. They have to be tested and examined and put through the ringer and see if it comes out on the other. No one person is qualified to say, yes, this is valid and reliable or not.
Yeah, but I'm a narcissist, so I kind of like it. But but Trisha and I, really, the gift we want to give with this book is to give the change management community a set of tools from philosophy and critical thinking to parse liar. And liar tests, your philosopher from Macquarie, Jennifer Dukyong, talks about, they don't always agree. Sometimes our intuition will say something is true, The critical thinker says, okay, hang on a minute, though. Can I think, for example, of a counterexample? And there are ways. And so our intuition is only part of the mix of what your philosopher from Macquarie calls epistemic virtuosity. Doesn't that sound like the kind of word that get you thrown out of a dinner party? Anyway, moving on to one or two examples of liar in action. So how many of you, well, here's a household example. Sugar makes kids hyper. How many of you have sat at a party or garden party in the afternoon? Children are running around. Maybe you're too old for that, or maybe you're too young. I don't know what the median age is here. Children are running around and one of the mums or dads says, oh my God, those kids have had sugar. Look at how hyper they are. And which I saw, and you're in the unfortunate position, if you're a person like me who doesn't get invited back, is to say, well, actually, there's no correlation between glucose consumption and activity levels in children. And they look at you as if, like, who invited you, you arsehole? It's common knowledge. Look at them. Look at the way they're running around, like, you know, they, of course it's made that. And of course, you know, that's fallacious reasoning. And it's an easy thing to test, right? You give glucose to some bunch of kids and you have a control group over here and you compare the activity levels and you can do a bit of science on it, and science doesn't back it up. So, and then again, that's part of the project, is also to be able to double check our intuition. So that's that. So let me, yeah, go on, Trish.
I was just gonna add to that. And that one's a really good example of liar, because like, intuition wise, like, oh my gosh, that makes sense, right? Glucose is the energy of our cells. Sugar is what, you know, is everything we digest is broken down to some type of sugar, and it is what creates energy. So maybe on an intuition level, it makes sense, like, oh, they had too much sugar. But then when you dive into the research piece of it, like, it's the way that the sugar is digested and broken down chemically, which I do not know the details. It doesn't support that it creates a short burst of energy in adults or children. It's just, and it's a wonderful example of really using liar to sort of parse different perspectives instead of just taking one and going, hey, that data point makes sense to me, or authority figure XYZ said so, it must be true. The critical thinker is going to try to parse through them. So it's a tool that really just helps you practice and improve critical thinking skills. And I think that that's a great example, because you do have to get into the deep science to understand why sugar wouldn't create a short burst of energy, but which isn't necessary to parse the argument or the claim. But it's a good example for when we talk about how valuable liar is and why we use it throughout the book.
I'm just looking at some of the comments. That's great. So here we are, and in the book we cover, Trisha, if I don't get all the bases, we cover denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and that we open the book with that. And I think that's the mythiest of the myths as well. And you'd want to ask yourself, like, what's the research evidence for denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance? Well, how do we know that's true? And people say, oh, well, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and she's one of the 20th century's top 10 most famous psychologists. And you say, well, okay, what did she actually say? Well, what evidence did she shed? And she studied the dying, not the grieving, not the families of the people who are dying. She didn't study people who are experiencing loss generally. And she didn't certainly study the people on the third floor information technology department going through an SAP implementation. I can guarantee you that. So what do, we should ask the question then, what do people think about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance today? What do grief specialists say in the 21st century? And they say, well, it was a start, but there's no, first of all, it's a very, very restrictive set of emotions. And there's no script for how one grieves. It's as individual as the individual. And they say, so there's no, with all of that in the 21st century, we know that that wasn't true even for the dying. But what happened was it was extrapolated to the grieving. And then it was extrapolated to loss generally. And then it was extrapolated to organizational change in the 1980s. And it was the first battle I learned. I sat down my first change management class. They stuck that in the word. This is what happens in change. So people say, well, hang on a minute. It may not be true but it's useful. It helps me empathize. And I want to push pause there. Does it really? Does having a sort of template? I mean, we're change people. We're supposed to be empathetic. That's one of the reasons we maybe even were attracted to this perception of empathetic. Does this help you be more empathetic? Does having a sort of templated notion for denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance help you empathize? Does it help you understand things? And then people say, well, here, there's a sort of nihilism that comes, a model nihilism, and say, all models are, no model is true, some models are useful. So all models are false, some are useful. And that's a sort of a nihilism. Now, there's a way in which it's true. But does that mean that a map of Westeros is going to get you to King's Landing, is going to get you to Oklahoma? No. It's not. You can't from that say, well, all models are equal and it doesn't matter what we use, and it's the way we use them. And it's anyway. So that's that way we open the book. And then there's learning styles, Myers-Briggs type indicator, resistance to change. Help me out, Tricia. Unfreeze change.
ADKAR.
ADKAR. Oh, ADKAR is a good one.
Resistance.
Yeah.
Change is hard, and neurobabble.
Neurobabble, that's right. Brain safe change.
Together.
And so that's a kind of tour of the background. It may be a bit theoretical, so I apologize for that. We haven't really gone into the specifics of, well, we went into a little bit with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Let me tell you one of my favorite ones is learning styles, and then I'm going to shut up and we'll have a discussion. So learning styles is particularly interesting to me because it was another model that I learned on day one of my Change Management 101 in 1994. Visual, auditory, VAK, VARC, visual, auditory, kinetic. God, my brain's something.
Kinesthetic.
Kinesthetic, and what's R? Reading? Yeah, reading. And I was taught that, and the reason I can't remember is there are actually 100 of those. But anyway, but the one that VARC is the most useful one. And so we ask ourselves in the book, learning styles is something I learned. And I read a book called The 50 Myths of Popular Psychology. Golly, if I can recommend a book to you, this is such a great book. It was written 25 years ago. It's got 50 things. There's sort of 3 or 4 pages. It's like, what's the evidence for this? What's the evidence that abstinence is the only way to recover from addiction? That's kind of dogma. Is that true?
But you have this popularity becomes a proxy for truth, which is one of the themes throughout the book.
Sure. And the recovery business is a substantially big industry. And I say, so let's go back to learning styles. So one of the things is it's a descriptive claim that we have preferences in the way we learn. Well, that's trivially true, right? And that's like true, but it's like trivially true that people have preferred ways of taking information. I like newspapers.
Right. I'm always 100% every time I'm going to pick up a book before I watch a video. That's just me. That is true. That in that sense, it's true.
But how many people have heard your change experts say, well, I'm an auditory learner. I don't really take in information that way, or I'm a visual learner. How many people have heard people say that? How many people say that themselves in their practice? How many people among us may design training with learning styles in mind? Because I used to, when we were designing training, I used to think, well, how are we going to present this to the visual learners? Or this is very things, how are we going to do it to the auditory learners or the kinesthetic learners? And so it's trivially true that people have preferences. And you would think that people prefer to take in information in a certain way. My kids like video much better than anything else, God help them. That they would learn faster and better because they prefer it. So they must learn faster and better. And again, that's something that you can test. You can test. You can get people's preferences, and then you can assess how they learn along different learning modalities. And do they, when you present content to people in accordance with their preferred learning style, learn faster or better? You can test that. The answer is no, they don't. Despite what we may think about the intuition of liar, I prefer visual, so ergo, I learn better visually. Well, one is a kind of descriptive statement that's trivially true, but the other one's a prescriptive statement, like you should show me information visually so that I learn better. And then one of the guys who wrote that 50 Myths of Popular Psychology was on my podcast. I just love this guy. And one of the criticisms of my criticism, if you will, is people say that it's an ethical claim that you should present information learning to people according to their preference to cater for the diversity of learning styles of human beings. That's an ethical claim. So even if they don't learn faster. And here's what this guy said to me, and this was revolutionary for me. He said, say you're coaching a young footballer. This is a 10-year-old girl. She's exceptionally good with her right foot, and she's got ambitions to be a well-rounded, play for her uni or her high school or whatever. Are you serving her by allowing her to, in a sense, practice her preference? Or are you, in a sense, going to have to teach her to be as comfortable on the left foot as she is on the right foot, or nearly as comfortable? And that's what Scott Lilienfeld, this author of Fitness Popular Psychology, said to me. He says, you're not serving them necessarily, because in today's world, you need to be a multimodal learner. You have to drink the learning nectar from whence it comes. And it might be visual, and it might be podcasts, and it might be kinesthetic. And so he said, actually, you may not be serving the learner by presenting them information in the modality in which they're most comfortable. And I went, holy shit. Wow. So that's a kind of tour. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Oh,
But also, can I add an important? Paul, do you mind if I add one?
Go for it.
And I'm almost always going to harp on the R part of LIAR, the research part, because that's where I'm really passionate about, is the evidence-based practice and things like that. But the interesting part of that is, so this was like a mind-blowing moment for Paul when it happened. But then we look at some of the research that's coming out, and I will be the first to say, not all, one study, two studies, someone wrote a book does not make it true. Science has to go through its progression in progress to determine what kind of certainty we can hold to ideas and claims. But what's really interesting about that was such a mind-blowing moment for Paul. And now we're seeing research come out. I'm sure we've all heard of the book Grit. I forget, Carol something from Stanford, I can't recall her name off the top of my head, is finding that actually it's indicating and pointing to that we are more likely to learn better when we are not comfortable, when we are outside of our comfort zone, which aligns directly.
Carol Dweck,
yes, thank you. I couldn't remember her last name.
Yeah.
Which actually aligns with what we're talking about. If that you don't necessarily learn better just because information is presented to you or content is presented to you in a way that you prefer, even if you do have a preference. And so you see how over time the progression of knowledge, and people will study, even Kubler-Ross, if we go back to DABDA, it was a hypothesis, it was a theory, she did some research on it. It ended up that when it was tried to be replicated and it was examined further under scientific research, ended up to not be true, even for the dying. So to say a study proves, or that I read this book and it's accurate, that is antithetical to critical thinking and the whole idea of progression of knowledge when it comes to evidence. Mm-hmm. And I just think that that's a great demonstration of that, because it's mind-blowing for Paul. And then now we're seeing more and more evidence come out that's supporting it. It's the discomfort that makes the learning more effective than it is the comfort and preference.
Yeah.
And here's the weird thing for me is that, like I was doing this stuff like denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and learning styles, and resistance to change, and unfreeze, change, refreeze, and all that kind of stuff. I was supposed to be an expert. Like, I mean, I was head of the change practice for PwC in London in 1999. And I look back and I think, God, I was full of shit. Really? I mean, it's not that I was always ineffective, but some of the beliefs that were guiding my activities were just really funky. Anyway, we'll leave it there. I would like to hear...
Paul, let's get some questions going. So we've got about half an hour. So I'm going to unpin you from, so is everybody okay? If you don't want to be on the recording, please turn your camera off, because I'm going to unpin both Trisha and Paul from the screens. And then we've got about half an hour for questions and answers, and we'll see where it goes. So let's do that now. Remove pin.
We've got so many people. Let's go. Who's got
exactly? I did say.
And not just questions,
Very-
you know, like if you have a point of view on this stuff, like have at it. Let's go.
Discussion and debate is part of
Yeah,
that
okay.
progression
I'm
of
going to
knowledge.
pick on somebody. I'm going to pick on Fran because you made a couple of points in the chat box. Over to you, Fran. You can't hide. If you want to turn your camera off, please do that.
No, all good. I find it quite fascinating. So thank you, Paul and Tricia, for sharing some of those insights, because the things you're touching on there are things that we've all probably used in work. Talking about Kubler-Ross, absolutely. And we're in the trough of despair now, and we're going to get out of this eventually. MBTI, Myers-Briggs, I mean, I've read the research kind of debunking all that a long time ago, but interesting to touch on that. I would like to hear what you say about ADKAR, because in the kind of advertising for this podcast, ADKAR was in there, and I know ADKAR is one of these very old change models, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Can I start on that one, Paul? Can I take that one first?
Have at it.
And then I'll let you wrap up on that. For me, ADKAR, it's problematic in a couple of ways. It goes back to the DABDA, the change curve, the fact that there was an underlying assumption that every single person behaves in a certain way in a sequential set of stages, just like DABDA, denial, anger, right? You have to have awareness before you have desire. And I think that that's one of its fundamental flaws, is that it's a staged-based sequential model that does not reflect human behavior, human thought processes. People are complex. They just don't work that way. I know I am ProSci certified, and I do actually work with clients that use ProSci. It's not my favorite, but nobody gets everything completely wrong either. There's some good stuff in ProSci, but ADKAR is not it. So you have that fundamental underlying assumption is false. And another underlying assumption around ADKAR that I really struggle with, and I think is problematic, is it assumes that information will change behavior. And I'm not saying information isn't, whether in the form of communications, in the form of training, all of these things you're basically delivering information, content and information, and assuming that will change behavior, which we know is not true, which isn't the case. Now, that's not to say that they don't need information. Part of a change manager's work is absolutely to inform and prepare. It's hard to have a strong opinion on something if you aren't even aware that it exists. So it's not to say that the information piece is incorrect and shouldn't be used, but that fundamental assumption that's underlying it, I'm using the logic piece now, right? There's a logical fallacy there. The assumption does not fit. We don't change our behavior based on information, and it's almost exclusively based on information in sequential stages. And then the last piece of that, and then this is the psychologist in me, I'm sorry. They just throw on reinforcement at the end, right? Which, yes, we know repetition is good. I wish they would call it repetition instead. But if you're going to call it reinforcement, we're getting into psychological theory around conditioning. So you have classical conditioning, which many people are familiar with as Pavlovian condition, Pavlov's dog. And you have operant conditioning, which is the punishment and reward, and whether it's positive or negative. Well, the research from conditioning and behavioral science research around that says that reinforcement only works when it immediately follows a stimulus. So to say we did all these training programs, we did all these newsletters, we did all these town halls, informed everyone knows what's coming. We gave them all these resources. And then at the end, throw in reinforcement, flies in the face of the research of how reinforcement actually does work. That's my take. I will let Paul take it from there.
I will give you 15 seconds. So behavioral science has taught us that the environment matters a great deal. The choice environment, the choice architecture. That's where this whole idea of nudges comes from. ADKAR is silent on that. It's also silent on other things. Like if I took a first-year student in psychology at Macquarie University, University of Perth, I said, what are the determinants of human behavior? They ought to be able to list about 25, and ADKAR lists 5. And so just to call out one, psychological safety, for example. We know, and there's a whole hell of a lot of evidence that suggests that psychological safety is important for change, it's important for learning. So it's not in there. So if you're using ADKAR to help a client manage change, and you quite possibly are living out 20 of the most, one of which, like psychological safety, might be the most important, lever that you have to pull. It's a very difficult lever to pull, by the way. But are you serving the client? Now, people go, well, it's simple and it makes change. Yeah, I said, I'm all in favor of simplicity. I am. And what is it they say, that old saw that they say, as simple as possible and not a bit more. And I think it's too simple. It's simple to the point of simplistic. And again, as Tricia said, that's called the information deficit hypothesis, which is that if you provide people with facts, they'll change their behavior, which is the most puerile rubbish. I mean, you could do, vaccination was a goodie in the United States. I don't know if you saw the same drama in Australia about vaccination, but there's a whole, I think the United States is about 78% vaccinated. And the 22% that aren't vaccinated aren't about to go get it because they think it's a government conspiracy and they think it doesn't work, and they have microchips in the vaccines and all kinds of horseshit. And a certain indifference to the public health consequences of their behavior, a certain moral turpitude, I would say. So information doesn't do, and there's something interesting in the science of organizational change called the backfire effect, whereas actually if someone's ideologically committed to a point of view, providing them facts strengthens their opposition. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating?
We're all definitely fascinating. So Paul, we've got a question from Gilbert. Gilbert, do you want to ask the question or do you want me to read it out?
Thanks for shutting me up. Oh,
I can read it out just as well. Thank you. You don't have to take his name in vain. So what's any of your views on It Starts With Why or The Golden Circle by Simon Sinek?
The Golden Circle, start with why. I'm not a fan of his because although I wish I was as good looking as him, and as charismatic, but he is all of those things. I can't comment. Trisha, Simon, you follow him more closely than me.
I do. I was actually responding in the chat because to that question, because Paul was talking about the previous topic. But I think it's nonsense. I think that Simon Sinek, I always take the mindset and frame of reference of like, no one's all wrong, no one's all bad, right? Like, he's an intelligent guy. He has some good ideas. He's really good at commercializing pithy, catchy statements.
Which had
do people care? Do
5% of his charismatic acumen?
Yeah, I mean, do people care about why? Absolutely. But people are complex. It's not about start with why. It's not about you have to have awareness before you have desire, and your blocker is desire if you don't have awareness yet. It's a tiny piece in a much larger puzzle of human behavior that is very complex. So no, I would never recommend saying like, don't even bother with the why. It's because it is a tiny piece of that puzzle. And that I think that it starts with why, it's always about the why, is nonsense.
Would you ever want to start with how? Or would you want to?
And again, why isn't going to change behavior? I'm going to out myself a little bit here that like, I know darn well that smoking is terrible and I've been doing it for decades and it's going to kill me and has shaved years off my life. I know it's terrible for my health. Like, I have all of that information. The why it does that, the why beyond that, I haven't quit yet.
Gilbert,
I'm in my late 40s and I haven't quit yet. So no, the why is never going to change behavior on its own.
Gilbert, you may have a more sophisticated view. I mean, it's sort of like there were 50, 60 or 100 things that we could have covered. What's your view?
I wouldn't necessarily put myself in the word sophisticated in one sentence when it comes to Simon Sinek. I think it's like what you describe in your book, quite harmful, the idea, because it's such an oversimplification that it makes everything suitable. And then you end up in this conversation with executives or just managers in teams. But it all starts with why, and then they trip over after 15 minutes because there's nothing behind the statement. You're like, okay, so where do we go now? I just wanted to check if my logic still holds, but
I don't.
Why is different for everybody. What's going to resonate with that room of executives that you're sitting around saying it starts with is going to be very different than the IT guy on the third floor that has to now enter data into SAP. Like, the why is very different. So again, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's a very, very tiny piece of a much larger complex puzzle. It doesn't start there.
Hey, we've got lots of comments going in the chat box. Any questions that you want to speak out? This is your opportunity. Go for it.
Sense of urgency. I see Rufat. Rufat, where are you from?
Oh, sense of urgency. This one's fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of these things that's a generalization. Say, so you were answering the question, where are you from?
I said I am from Mexico.
From Mexico?
Mexico.
Buenas. How you doing, man? So on urgency, I just left IBM, and it's an organization that runs on urgency. And it's the leadership culture there that we're always sort of teetering on the edge of crisis. And that applies to consultant utilization, that applies to the necessary to bring in sales, necessary adopting new technology, everything is urgent at IBM. And there's one logic gives us a little thing of everything is urgent, then nothing is urgent. And there's also a question in my mind when you think about sense of urgency is like, is that true, or do organizations today need to take a chill pill? Our workers, these poor targets of multiple conflicting change agendas. I mean, I once ran a class at a university in America, and I said, I want you to list all the change initiatives that you're involved in. There's like 30 people in the room, something like that. And each of them listed 10 or 12 or 15 change initiatives that were going through their organization. And I really began to wonder, kind of an interesting bit of quote unquote research, is urgency what's required? Is that going to get the job done? And in an organization where everything is urgent, nothing is urgent, right? So I just wonder about the guidance. I also wonder about things like psychological safety. I also wonder about things like having fear as a motivator, because that's certainly part of the IBM culture. So I'm not a great fan of it. Now we look at it in the book a bit more formally than I just have. Whatever.
And I'm going to jump in with my research piece, of course.
All right. Good.
It's harmful in the long term. It's stress. You're seeing people burn out because it's do more with less. But scientifically, urgency it can create a short burst of energy. But we're talking short, like hours, days. And then after that burst of energy, there is a lull. So it not only is the reaction that you're getting by trying to create this sense of urgency so short-lived that there's no value to it. If you try to extend that by over and over again, creating another sense of urgency, you're creating harm because you're increasing stress levels to an unhealthy level that in the long term create obesity, heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of health problems. When we're expected to live in this heightened state of anxiety created from urgency when it's not an emergency, and you maintain that over time, that's where you come into the really big harm. But because it's so short-lived, you're not getting what you think. It's not going to make people more likely to change. We're talking hours and days they might have a burst of reaction and energy. And during that burst of reaction and energy, their ability to think critically, use the executive part of their brain and think in a way that is absolutely necessary in today's day and age diminishes. So it's harmful in more ways than one. Now, if it's a real emergency, that's a different story, right? I think in the book we said when the movie theater's on fire, yes, okay, fair enough.
Put down the popcorn.
So we've got loads of Trisha, we've got loads of questions coming in. Just conscious we've only got about 14 minutes. So we've got Sarah, we've got Dennis. Who would like to go with their questions? Sarah, for some reason we can't hear you. Not sure why.
How about now?
That's it, brilliant.
So I was just wondering whether most myths are about giving people excuses either not to have the skills or to not perform an action. So it seems like the ones that really take off are the ones that I guess, excuse your part in things perhaps, or take away agency. I was just,
Have you read the book? Have you read it yet?
I've started it.
So there's a bit at the end, which, you know,
It's in there.
Oh,
were-
is it?
we were 2 years into writing the book, and Trisha and I,
I think chapter 3.
that
Yeah.
conclusion, we wrestled with that conclusion for a long
Oh,
time.
okay.
And it wasn't until we were writing the conclusion that it occurred to me that some of these notions, so one of the paradigmatic things in organizational change world is change is hard. It's hard, it's emotionally difficult. And I just wonder if that's a get out of jail free card for leaders.
Yeah.
It's like if people are suffering during change and they go, well, change is hard, you know, well, they've got over it. You know, it points the telescope the wrong way, because we got to be thinking about what makes change hard or easier. We can be more sophisticated, more granular, and just this kind of blanket statement that change is hard. We can think about what kinds of change are hardest, what environmental conditions, what culture make change harder, what leadership behaviors make changes, you know, what kind of, to use one of your introductions, skills, you know, make change easier or more difficult. Like, there are more nuanced and complex and sophisticated ways of thinking about change than changes are. But I do worry that that paradigm gives leaders a get out of jail free card. And it leaves them to say, well, change is hard. It wouldn't have mattered had we done things differently from the start. Inevitably, it probably might have, you know, we submit that it might have. It didn't have to be this difficult. So I don't know.
Similar. Oh, sorry.
I think that's a great provocation, a great question, Sarah.
And I'm just going to say, similarly, in the conclusion, we sort of talk about, like, we have these models like ADKAR and DABDA and things like that. They all focus on the individuals that are receiving the change, for lack of a better term, like, that are expected to actually make the behavior change, right? And we talked about earlier, the environment, the situation is has a huge impact on behavior. By focusing on the recipients thereof, or the people that are expected to change, also creates that get out of jail free card. We are the leaders. We want this done. Change, you OCM person, go make them do it. That also steals agency and points the telescope the wrong way and loses that focus.
Someone asked a very good question. Peter Krantz, I believe. Peter, you asked, how do we know, is there any evidence to say some things work better than others? There is a chapter, and there's a really super book that Trisha and I do an imperfect service to, but we do give it a big shout out. It's called Reconsidering Change Management, which isn't the best title for it. And what it does is it takes 18 things that people say about change. 70% of all change interventions fail. Resistance to change needs to be diffused early. A fair change process is necessary. Organizational is important. Transformational leadership works better than transactional. So there are a lot of things that people say about change. They're Dutch academics, go through and look at the research on all of those and try and give a balanced appraisal of how much research there is, what the quality of the research is, and in what direction does the research evidence point. There's a 70% of all change evidence fails. There's not much evidence, and the evidence there is says that it's rubbish, for example. So without launching into that, there's a whole chapter which basically said, this is the state of the world of evidence and change management. Now, on the positive side, we do find that goal setting is really important in organizational change. We find that managerial behavior, there's reasonable evidence that managerial behavior is important in organizational change. Who knew? What else are some of the ones that are very positive? Trust is one. Trisha, name one or two of the ones that for which there's positive evidence.
Yeah, trust was one of them, which, and the terminology they used to research these two has some bearing on it. So trust is probably related to psychological safety. Give me one moment and I will tell you what some of them are.
I have it up, but I don't want the computer to crash again.
So
let's grab one more question. So yeah, we do promise you a chapter in the book that reviews evidence and then has some of the, there it is right there. There it is right there. I saw another super good question from Claire Penny Owen. Do you want to speak your question to the group?
You're on mute, Claire. You're still on mute.
We can't hear you.
No.
Where are you?
Okay, how's that?
Ah, excellent.
Wonderful. Hi.
G'day.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm in Perth in Western Australia. Thanks for the fantastic discussion. The question I had is, look, obviously we've seen the various models. We've talked about that again, that not all of them are right. There's some of them have some interesting information, but how do we then help explain the appropriate way to approach change or discuss change to others again, who sometimes we're working with don't actually have the time to consider it or carefully or want to. And obviously, we're talking about some of the positives here around leadership and trust. Obviously, what is the most appropriate place to start?
What a big question.
Yeah.
I guess it means, are you thinking about individual change primarily?
Well, no, I'm thinking more organizational change, to be honest. But fundamentally, it's about, again, helping others understand that actually you need to consider change and give change a fair go.
I think it's, to my mind, axiomatic that the organization is involved too late and too little. And frequently in my first experience as a change manager, I was brought on when the shit had already hit the fan, like really badly. Like, we got this change program for 400 finance people in the finance function in British Airways, and 25% of them left a year down the project. And that would be all very well if they're the people that were doing a day's work. But what happens when the shit hits the fan is the people with good looking CVs leave it. And the ones that so that was, and then we were brought in, and of course we were brought in to sprinkle change pixie dust on the project. So I would say that's axiomatic for me, is that it's too little and too late. And that leaders don't really think early enough about, how do I involve people in discussions about strategy? How am I going to involve people in discussions about what technology will serve them, not just serve the business? And for me, we've inherited a very sort of hierarchical view. Trisha calls it the great man hypothesis in the book. I mean, she's not the first person to coin that phrase, but is that we kind of have the answers up here, and historically it's been more men than women, and we'll let you know when we need your opinion. We'll let you know. And to me, it's extremely dysfunctional. If you look at it at a 500-year timescale, there was this radical idea that people should have a say in matters that affect their livelihood and lives, right? That's a kind of radical view, this democratization, and we're all equal and we should all have a say in matters that are important to us. That's like crazy idea 500 years ago. And it hasn't progressed into organizations. Like when you join a company, you give away a considerable say, a considerable voice. And in the United States, you give away a lot of rights. The only right you really have in a US workplace is right not to be abused and the right to leave. And so I think we're still like in a sort of like, if I go out to hundreds of years time frame, still thinking about how we democratize organizations. And there are experiments around the world in direct democracy, where democracy isn't something that you do once every 4 years, as has happened in the United States, but it's something that's almost a daily deliberation with one another about the choices that are important to us as a society, as a country, as a company, whatever. And so I think that's the undiscovered country. And that's my hope that 100 years from now, when I have shuffled off this coil, something like that, the more organizations are run that way. And we have the technology now to have continual discussions with people about the context, the why, what matters and why it matters, and what we ought to do about it, and how we should organize our strategy, all of that. We have technology for that kind of scale engagement, but the mindset isn't there for people typically at the top, because conditioned to think that they have all the answers or most of the answers. So
I would add to that, Claire, that it's just a great question, because I don't think any of us have perfect answers to it. I'm of the mindset that we need to push more for characterizing human behavior and the human condition as a complex system, which requires more experimentation and trying things out than is desired in hierarchical environments. But that there's always that tension with the commercialization. I mean, what we do for a living, we do it professionally, and we do it to put a roof over our head and food on the table. And what those people that are purchasing our services like to hear is ADKAR. Everybody acts this way. We can make, you know, that there is pixie dust, to use Paul's term. And it's just not the reality of the situation. So that there's a great question that I grapple with every single day. And there's a very strong tension between what they will buy and what they want to hear versus what reflects the reality of the situation. But I would recommend looking into, at least at a high level, just complexity theory. There's a little bit of it in the book too, about some of the characteristics and what that means when something behaves as a complex system. The biggest one that I already mentioned is learning is experimental. It's trying out different things. You're seeing a lot of that in the social media marketing field. They're doing a lot of like A/B, quick turnaround, get data back research. Is LinkedIn working better? Or is there a time of day that works better? You're seeing some of that get adopted, that experimental mindset getting adopted there. But again, it's not easy, and it's not something that the people that are going to write you that check or sign that check necessarily want to hear. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it's one of the great challenges of our profession and our field right now.
Fantastic. So on that note, I'm going to call a formal close to the session. I don't know if Paul and Tricia, if you want to stay on for a few minutes after, if people have got questions, I'm happy to stay on as well. And I just want to say a massive thank you to both of you for joining in today. Please go and buy the book. It's out there now, and also please write a review on Amazon. Reviews on Amazon are so important, as I know myself. So it's a fantastic book. For those of you who haven't yet read it, I hope you found the conversation stimulating and has prompted you to go and find out more. That was a fantastic question to end on. So Paul and Tricia, thank you so much for today. Thank you everybody for joining in. There will be a recording. If you want to stay on afterwards, I will carry on the recording so we can have those questions as well. But understand.
May I say one thing? May I say one thing? Please connect with us on LinkedIn. Please friend us on LinkedIn. And twice a year, I write out a newsletter when a new book comes out. So you can go to my website and you can get one of those another annoying that will tell you when a new book comes out. But please we
had a lovely slide that had pictures and QRC codes to buy the book and things like that. But obviously that was a tech fail.
We can send that out with a link. Also, if you let me have that, I'll send that out as a PDF.
Actually, I'll send you the slides and you can send them around.
Yeah, perfect.
I'll save it as a PDF first, Paul, though, so she doesn't have the font.
I look forward to those of you who stick around. Otherwise, thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you so much.
And Ro, back at you. Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Always a pleasure talking about this topic.
Who's sticking
Thanks,
around?
Everyone.
I can stay on for about 5 or 10 too, if anyone wants to.
Who have I met? Pete. How are you, mate?
I'm really well. I apologize, but I am going to have to head off to work. But I will just say, to conclude, that I really enjoyed this. What I struggle with is, as someone who's never really had any training or formal learning in change, I struggle with helping people deal with change. And I really liked Patricia's comment about the complexity of helping people change. I think probably maybe it's not surprising that I struggle to support people to change, because the myth, maybe it is a myth that it's hard, but maybe sometimes it's really hard and sometimes it's not. I accept that, but I certainly have had struggles in trying to help people go through change, and I suspect it is to do with complexity. I don't know if that's a useful observation.
Thank you.
It's a good theory. We need to, as a profession, play that out more and find out. But it's a great theory, and it's one that I feel strongly about.
But are you saying you don't think there's much evidence at this stage? I mean, I think the thing is that when I think about evidence, there of course is scientific research, double-blind controlled trials, those sort of things. But there's also observation, and surely humans are wired for observation and making conclusions based on observation.
Yeah.
Evidence comes in many, many different flavors. And I think there's definitely evidence to support that human behavior and the human condition behaves as a complex system. I think what we don't have the answers for, and I think is so important for our profession, is that we explore that further and test it and see if it actually does work and makes our jobs a little easier. Because while I'm with Paul, to say all change is hard is nonsense. It's a gross generalization. That doesn't mean that it isn't difficult when you're helping people change, especially large groups of them in an organization. Our job is not easy. It's not writing a newsletter.
We haven't heard from Gail, who stuck around. Thank you, by the way, Pete. Thanks, Pete. I hope.
Thank you so much, Simon. Have a great day, everybody.
See you soon. Take care.
I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Gail.
I'm a very good friend of Ro, and so
How are you?
I don't read. I don't know anything about this. I'm learning about this change only through Ro. I'm actually a bookkeeper.
Lovely. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. Thanks for
So
coming.
good to understand that, just to change people's mindset, taking accountability of their finance. And I think you know, unbeknownly, I can learn stuff, even if it's not field and no idea. Sometimes half the stuff that Ro
even if you don't work, even if you don't work in the change profession, like we're talking about the human condition, we're talking about people and how they behave and critical thinking that applies to all walks of life, right? Like in terms of ourselves and understanding our own limitations and seeking out ways to learn more and improve our critical thinking skills. In terms, I mean, it can be kids or parents or friends, you know, like hearts and minds doesn't work. Is that is knowledge that applies and benefits across the spectrum, across the world. Well, it does, whether you're a bookkeeper, a change professional, a professional researcher, anyone. And I think that's one of the things that attracts me to change, I think.
Yeah, well, I've never heard the critical thinking, and I think it's something that to be aware of, because we are living in an information overload and conflicting information.
Which is we didn't actually have time to.
I'm not putting those microchips on my arm.
Yeah.
we ran out of time in terms of covering it as a little brief during the first 30 minutes. But there's also in the book, there's a section, I mean, it was hard to write because academic research and evidence, and what is evidence, and what are the different kinds of evidence, and having to weigh, you know, the most important thing about critical thinking is that ability to weigh different data points and pieces of evidence or flavors of evidence appropriately. And it's a massive academic topic. There's textbooks that I could fill my garage with on it, but we tried to write it in a way just to give those basics, to get somebody started down that path of understanding what are the different flavors of evidence, where are their strengths, where are their weaknesses, to become a better critical thinker. We weren't trying to rewrite the statistics and research design textbooks that there are so many of, but just to help people like start down that path and like, what are some things I can learn? What are some things I can try and practice? It's always about practice, right? To become a better critical thinker. So you make a great point.
Yves Pascal or Dennis? Yves Pascal, you've been very, very quiet. I assume you're French by that lovely French name.
Yes, Paul, great assumption. Sorry, I'm based in Singapore. I had a short night, so I'm not presentable this morning. So that's why I kept my camera off. But my, yes, what I think, yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's a very interesting way to look at things. I agree with a lot of models that we use without a lot of substance and research behind. In terms of assessment, I think there are some assessments that are a bit better made than others. I'm thinking about Hogan, H-O-G-A-N, which look at personality and with a lot of science behind. And I'm also a strengths finder practitioner. So yeah, I think knowing our strengths and what we are naturally good at, it's a good starting point for two reasons. One, because if we want to be very good at something, it's good to tap on something that we are naturally talented for. Another thing is it's good to know that sometimes we might use that too much, too much, and then it becomes our biggest derailers. And yes, I think it's good to stretch, to expand, to go out of comfort zone, but it depends where we are in our career and what is needed from us. I think also knowing what we are naturally good at. I like the book Talent Delusion for Thomas Shamor-Premudzik that said talent is a personality at the right place. So
here's my one question about StrengthsFinder and self-report questions is they play back to us our self-concept. They ask us questions about ourselves, our favorite subject for many human beings, and they ask us structured questions, and out of that they play back to us some ideas. So if I were to do StrengthsFinder, I did it like 10 years ago or something like that. You know, I'm strategic and I'm creative and and there is something in the book called the Forer effect. I invite you to check out. Is how accurate are our self-perceptions? For example, without being too political, but I'm going to be political. We had a president 4 years ago who would have thought of themselves as honest, full of integrity, you know, a man of the people, someone who fights the good fight for, you know, all people, regardless of gender or race or ethnicity, right? That would be this individual's self-concept, right? Now, if they filled out a questionnaire, which asked them about their strengths or their Myers-Briggs or something like that, would playing back their self-concept to them be useful? You know, vous avez the office en France, vous avez le bureau, the office.
Le bureau, yes, the office, yes.
Le bureau, comédie, hein?
Yeah.
You know, those two leaders are incredibly dysfunctional leaders, and you have to ask yourself, and they think of themselves as men of the people and these fantastic leaders who involve people and they're supportive and all of that kind of stuff, and they're sort of idiots.
I agree. And
so that's my worry anyway.
So I always score that with kind of 360.
Yes.
So
yes,
when I use Hogan with my client, or when I debrief StrengthsFinder with the team, it's interesting to see how others see that in the person or not.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's having only one data point is not enough. But when you combine, when you do a Hogan 360 plus the Hogan,
right, you look for patterns that point in a consistent direction.
Yeah,
very good.
And you use the word science there when you were talking about StrengthsFinder. I would
not about StrengthsFinder. I said it
about Hogan.
No, not okay. I know the limitation of StrengthsFinder.
Okay. Just, I mean, again, I would just stress, like, there's different flavors of evidence, there's different kinds, they all have strengths and weaknesses. Even your best run, well-designed, double-blind twin study comes with the inherent weaknesses of a quantitative research design. So it's more about those patterns, and across different types of science and research, are they pointing in the same direction? So I'm going to go back to ProSci, but this applies somewhat to Hogan. Hogan's a lot better. And I know I've said this a handful of times throughout the talk. No, most of these things are not all bad, right? Like even ProSci does a really good job when they're talking about sponsorship and leadership and getting people involved in that sense. So even Hogan and StrengthsFinder, they're not all bad, they're not all terrible, but they have inherent strengths and weaknesses. Paul touched on some of the weaknesses of any kind of self-report survey. That is one of their big weaknesses. You also have science that is empirically testing the underlying assumptions on which something is based. So in terms of Hogan, the research that they publish, it's more large amounts of data that help them create norms and patterns on the existing tool. They aren't empirically testing the underlying assumption of their tools, because they have many, right? And again, I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus or dog Hogan or anything. He's actually one of the more credible out there. But there's always attention. There's also always a tension between what is the science really telling us and commercialization, right? In commercialization, your marketing and your selling, you're going to do the things you know that are going to get the reaction that you want, which is, this is how everybody acts, that I have science behind this assessment tool. Even the Rorschach, I was earlier in my career, I was trained and certified to deliver the Rorschach. And yeah, they have massive amounts of data that show different patterns and norms across responses. but that isn't the same thing as empirical testing of its underlying assumptions. You know, it's I know it's science, it's complicated, but.
Et Pascal, je suis moitié francophone.
Très bien, bravo.
Je peux parler LinkedIn, établissement de connexion, quoi.
Je vous ai envoyé déjà une demande de connexion, c'est fait.
Super.
Merci.
Dennis, you haven't. Well, you've been chatting away in the commenting in the chat, but you haven't. I know you've got strong views, buddy.
Let's hear them.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I had to make some here so I'd remember them. Right. So my compliments. Cheers, Patricia, Tricia, and Paul. I think I was waiting for your book for a while. Finished it, loved it. I did a recommendation on Amazon for you, but here's I got a bunch of things already kind of like I've been with. So and I said in my Amazon.com Amazon review that besides the great analysis of some of these myths, and I think ultimately I'd like to hope that the liar model and the critical thinking and analysis of these things, hopefully that's ultimately more valuable for folks even, right? Because every time we turn around, there's something else being proposed.
And we could sell more books if either of us were willing to say, we know the answers, this is what you do, this model's right, this model's wrong, you will succeed at every possible client and change environment that you are working in if you do it our way. But that's not reality.
Yeah,
we don't know. We don't have all the answers. Knowledge is continually progressing. We learn as we go.
Yeah, and one other thing before I forget, and then I'll come back to that, Tricia, but I heard in some of these discussions, I think it's really important for folks to keep individual change and the process individuals go through is very different than at a group level. And a lot of times I think people mix those up. And especially in what change practitioners are doing on the job, at least for me, it's, I don't know, more than 90%, 95% groups. And then more of the individual coaching and those kinds of things, they're pretty select because that's hugely time consuming on things. So anyway, that and I will say, I love the liar framework. And sometimes I think thanks for reminding me, I think I had a really great liberal arts education. Because I think I tend to think that way. And I didn't realize it as an undergrad because everybody was in the same school. And then I got to graduate school and exposed with a lot of people from different educations. And then it really jumped out to me. And so anyway, it's my support for liberal arts education as well.
Thank you for your friendship and support, by the way.
Here for liberal arts education.
Well, say one more thing, Paul. I noted here was at page 171. Here's the thing. So for folks that don't know me, I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. In my training, if you couldn't support what you were saying, you were grilled and you were eventually kicked out of the program. Yeah. You had to have some kind of basis for what you were saying, right? Direct research, something was applied in another area, it's logical, whatever, right? And one of the biggest challenges I had is being a consultant, and you guys, Tricia, you and Paul really spelled it out here on page 171, where you say researchers tend to use more uncertain expressions such as the weight of the evidence, based on the current evidence, research indicates or suggest, that kind of, findings suggest. Yeah. But consultant,
but it doesn't sell. It's that tension of, it's part of the human condition that there are no perfect answers for. It's not, yes, if you read an article that says a new study proves, that is a massive red flag if you're trying to be a better critical thinker, because one study does not prove anything.
Right.
And language matters, words matter. And I don't think you're ever just going to find the perfect environment where everything has to be supported, because we're talking about business and corporations, and it is and commercial matters and commercial concerns, but you can try to strike a balance that you're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So
Right.
can I just bring the conversation to a close? But Paul, do you?
Sure, because I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, do you want to just mention where you're going with your research and what your next project is? Because obviously this will be part of the recording as well. And I don't know if you want to just flag what's coming next as well.
Oh, I'm writing a book with Trisha as co-editors, where we've solicited chapters from around the world on what we think the leading edge of change management might be. So some on behavioral science, some on inclusion behaviors and change management, some on perhaps psychological safety, sustainability and change management, gamification and change management, ChatGPT and change management. So we've got, I think, 5 chapters have been submitted. And over the course of the next 3 to 5 months, we'll go into editing and production mode. And with any luck, by the end of the year, we'll have a short collection of
Awesome.
essays, chapters on the
We thought
future.
it was just such a great extension of changeness, because here we are sitting here saying, we don't have all the answers. We don't know. Knowledge progresses over time, and with all these different flavors of evidence, that we're soliciting chapters of from other people that sort of say, what is their vision for the future around a specific topic. So I think it's a great next step and extension to what we did in Changemess.
Amen.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you also for spending a few more minutes on the end there. That was brilliant. For those of you listening to the recording, obviously you've got the latest here on what's next. So that's brilliant. Link up with Paul and Trisha on LinkedIn. Thanks to the 3 of you for staying behind as well and asking those fantastic questions and observations. That was brilliant. So thanks so much. And I'm going to stop the recording now.
All right.